Well, seeing that raise of hands around the room, there's obviously a lot of expertise already here, and so I am at risk of telling you things you may already know. But I am going to try and talk about, as Phil said, around these urban design, master planning process, really which has come right through some work we've done with the South East 7 group of authorities. And it's nice to see Bronwyn in the audience here today. So if there are any questions I can't answer around the work, from why they were doing it to the sort of outcomes, then I'm sure Bronwyn can help. Sorry if I've just thrown you in that, Bronwyn. But it's nice to see you all here today. So, as I say, at risk of telling you things you already know, our places are shaped by water. All of our towns and cities and most of our villages are in the places they are for some reason to do with water, whether that's because it's physically shaped the environment around them, whether it was there for access to water, for transport, whatever it might be. But our relationship with water is changing, and we now have this problem where we keep trying to get rid of water as fast as we can. And when we get rid of water as fast as we can, it picks up lots of nasties. We have more harder surfacing. It runs very fast into our sewer system. That is essentially the nuts and bolts of the problem we're facing. And when it runs so fast into those confined spaces, sometimes it has nowhere to go except come back out again. And when we're dealing with a combined stormwater system, that overflow is full of other nasty things that you don't probably want in and around where you're going to be living. So we want to be managing that as effectively as we can. There are still around 20,000 combined sewer overflows in the UK. So if it doesn't come back out into out of the sewer, out of the stormwater grill, it comes out of the other end. We're taking pressure off, and you have all those nasties going back out into our natural environment. 27% of our water bodies aren't currently meeting Water Framework Directive water quality standards. So over a quarter of our water bodies are not as good as they should be, and we're going to be fined for that as a country. And then there's obviously the other issue around flooding and managing flood risk, whatever form of flood risk that might be. We're seeing increased problems around there. Obviously climate change is exacerbating a lot of these issues. So how can we hold some of that water back so it's not running so fast into our waterways, so it's not polluting our waterways so much, and we can keep a handle on our water resources. On the flip side of the story, we're also facing chronic water shortages. 2012 we had both drought and flooding in the same year. By 2025, London, Forbes' world most economically powerful city in the world, will have a 10% water deficit. In just 10 years' time, we're going to be facing not enough water in our capital. Somewhere like Yorkshire Water has a 17% deficit over a similar sort of time period. We're sort of running out of water. And for a sort of perception of a wet country, that's quite a stark fact. Places like east of England are as dry as parts of the Middle East and are facing real problems, not to mention the sea level rise that might come with a longer-term climate change. And then the legacy of our water and utilities infrastructure is one which doesn't really give much back to the community. It's generally a manhole cover and not a lot else. And given the disruption that they may have been facing in getting that into place, then it's not really giving something back. And it's this last point which I guess is the crux of where I want to sort of start thinking about where we're coming from in linking all those stormwater issues with placemaking and urban design. Because I think urban design and thinking about water in space and around us like we used to, or when we used to shape our settlements, is fundamental to solving the solution. And that's where we really start talking about water-sensitive urban design. The rest of it should be on there somewhere. But that's the sort of concept of water-sensitive urban design. It's about the process of integrating water cycle management within the built environment using design and planning. So when we talk about water cycle management, we're talking about managing the whole of the water cycle more locally. We have a very separated, segregated water system at the moment. We have different supply to drainage to flood risk management. And I think it's that sort of organisational complexity which is actually the crux of our problem. We know in this room, I think, how to solve all the problems. It's just perhaps an organisational issue of how we can all work together to do it. But so water-sensitive urban design is this bigger picture of water cycle management, integrating water cycle management in the design and planning process. And SuDS, they're the component parts that build up to give a water-sensitive place. There's a whole variety of different types of SuDS, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But at best, that whole system can be done in one location. So we can use a SuDS system or a SuDS train to convey, collect, clean, store, and put that water back into effective reuse in a very small space. So somewhere like Northwest Cambridge is trying to do that. If you haven't seen that development, look it up. It's quite a good one. At worst, we should be putting SuDS in place just to slow down the flow of water and reduce some of the peak flows that are in our sewer system and take the pressure off there. So in essence, what we're trying to say is we're going to replicate sort of a natural water balance process, replicating the natural water cycle, but in the complexities of an urban environment. So allowing for some level of infiltration, allowing for some level of attenuation and allow it to evaporate back off. So it's not hitting the ground and running very fast off into our sewer system. When it comes to that sort of process of when we engage with drainage as a development organisation or as a consultant, we tend to find that drainage is really only considered at sort of an outline planning permission place in the development life cycle, maybe even later. At this point, the GFAs for a development have already been sorted out. The layout of the development has generally been sorted out, and it's very difficult to sort of shoehorn in different drainage aspects, particularly if drainage is not anything more than you need to be able to manage a certain level of flow. But we haven't really sorted out the methodology at that point. So what we were thinking is Water Sensitive Urban Design tries to take that a much further, much higher up the sort of design hierarchy, right in from the conceptual stages, to understand that the water is really a fundamentally shaping element of a design process. It shouldn't be something that was thought of later in the day. If it's being thought of earlier in the design process, you need to engage a lot more different people in the process that you might not engage before. So it's not only the realm of the drainage engineers, but it has to be the architects, the landscape architects, the ecologists, and all the other people involved in the development process. And that's where we come to the Southeast 7 master planning. It says master planning for SuDS guidance on that slide, which is entitled Water, People, Places, as is the title of this. And it really came out of a position a couple of years ago when we first started this process. So things were even more up in the air than they are now. But in any case, the National Planning Policy Framework says there should be a priority use for SuDS anyway. So in that sense, it's always, or should have always been, a part of the planning process. The Flood and Water Management Act started changing, it was like 5 years ago nearly. We're still not really at a point where we've gone much further than getting SuDS into the planning process. And then the issue around national SuDS standards was still up in the air. Didn't really know what was going on, although it was coming and going at that point. So the real objective was to respond to this level of uncertainty in a positive manner, and rather than be confined by the stipulations and the irregularity in the sort of regulatory process and legislative process at the time, just to create a sensible toolkit for placemaking using water as the starting point. And that's what it looks like, the final document. It is on Kent County Council's website. Bronwyn? Yep. And several of the other partners. It was for the Southeast 7, although actually 9 authorities were involved, so it's really the Southeast 9. And they came together to try and develop this design framework through which all sort of master planning processes should go. And different authorities out of those 9 are going to use this in different ways, but the idea was it sets out that framework. And the framework was positioned through sort of 3 sort of conceptual levels: prepared, design, define and design. And then the design bit was split again into 3, around buildings and building plots, around the street network or the movement network, and around open spaces and more defined space. Essentially, the prepare element is really about setting your aims and objectives, really understanding what you want to achieve on the site. Now, if SuDS standards were there at the time, then obviously there's something to work towards. If they're local ones, which you're going to hear a bit more about later on, then those things can be put in place early on. But crucially, you have to think about the broader business case for delivering SuDS. SuDS isn't just about delivering somewhere to manage your water, as the theme throughout my presentation is. It's about all those other things you can leverage from your SuDS network, whether that be open space, biodiversity, air quality improvements. The list of green infrastructure benefits is almost endless. So if you can make a link with other problems, create that bigger business case, it's much easier to convince earlier on. And then you can start looking at the conceptual framework for water, so understanding what assets you've already got on site to make it work. Now, although this is represents a big site in the picture, we actually did this for several different scales of site, right from a sort of few houses on a Muse street, right up to a sort of large campus area, an industrial commercial area. There are assets already on the site, so water bodies, drainage ditches, pieces of green space already that you can use as part of your toolkit. And from that, you can start building up your sort of spatial framework of where you want your SuDS to work. So identifying your high points and your low points, the flow paths, the critical points, where you might discharge through the discharge hierarchy, trying to keep it on site for reuse if possible, and then going down the discharge hierarchy. And ultimately, assembling a right team at the right time to be able to think around the sort of broad spectrum of issues. Building up, if it is a large site, you might want to start thinking about how that breaks down into different catchment areas. So manage the catchments in their own areas. And this is starting to shape, where you are going to put your development longer term, but we haven't even got to that point yet. So thinking about the different areas, thinking about if there's more contamination in one area, do you need a longer treatment train to be able to take some of the pollutants out? You can allocate your treatment stages, and you can also start to have high-level estimates of your attenuation volumes. But as you get into more detail, you start layering up the different elements that you want to see in a master plan. You can start to link your structures and your conveyance paths with other movement networks. So looking at the synergies between people movement and water movement is often go hand in hand. Looking at where your open space and your green space is going to be, and if you can use those areas for storage and filtration. And ultimately, you can come up with a sort of spatial diagram at the end of that, which you can then use as the building block for the development profile. But it always is about reflecting the local conditions, and obviously there are all sorts of ground conditions which you may face on a particular site. You may have several of these on one site. And so it's really important for us to be able to convey a message that there is a SuDS solution for just about every site that you might come across. Whether that be contaminated or really high groundwater levels, or a really constrained site, there will be something in your toolkit which you can start to utilize. And so we looked at lots and lots of different types of SuD, and we said where you'd be able to put them, and we started coming up with some sort of high-level rules of where they would be used and how they should be used. And gave this large matrix, if you like, which basically says if this is your conditions of your site, these are the SuDS that you might be able to use. And so you can very quickly say, right, this is in my toolkit to be able to use on this particular site, in this particular location, subcatchment that we've defined. But as I said at the start, it's about, or earlier on, it's about leveraging those other benefits and seeing what other things you might be able to do other than just storing your water, if it's water quality, or then actually moving on to amenity space, open space, climate control, all those other things. So we made a similar sort of matrix where we looked at the different types of activity you might be doing, the different types of SuD that you might be utilizing to show the other benefits you might be able to achieve at the same time. So you've again got another element of your toolkit to be able to present to developers, saying actually you could do this biodiversity activity at the same time as you could be achieving your water quality benefits. And ultimately, it's about creating great places. And doing all those things together, you can start to have a sort of high-level quality of design. Keeping water above ground means you have to spend more attention thinking about how it's going to look in the end. So a lot of the benefits you might be getting around amenity are through high quality, good design. And you can do that in a number of different ways, whether it be on the street or a very urban, hard environment, or on the rooftops, or a more rural environment. So there are lots of different situations where you might be able to apply SuDS. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much. It's Michael Henderson at AECOM.com.